And so this has made me realize that I need to make an important clarification on the numbers that I presented. Is the percentage numbers that were up there were not meant as any kind of normative endorsement or recommendation. In fact, I will refrain from saying anything about what should be Australia's target. And I think it is really important, as Malte pointed out just then, the Australian triple challenge: carbon exporter, carbon intensive economy, but also very high per capita emissions and high per capita income. This will really shape, or is shaping, has been shaping perceptions of Australia in the international sphere. We'll take a few minutes for question and answer. Who's first? Oh, I'll turn the lights back on. Who's first? Lisa, did you? Yep, okay.
Hi, I'm Lisa Cox from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. My question is for Anthea. Anthea, you spoke in some detail about the review that the Climate Change Authority, okay, there we go, is conducting of post-2020 targets. That review last year was described by the Environment Minister as a gesture in order to pass direct action through the Senate. We heard David just now speak about broad consultation outside of government for setting post-2020 targets. Do you have a sense that the government will consider the CCA's findings in setting its targets, and have they approached you for any advice?
Well, the government will make its decisions, and I'm sure they'll take a broad range of things into account. But in terms of have we been asked for advice, we were asked to do the review, so we have these terms of reference. So it's a serious task. We've been asked to do it. It's a review. The government will be required to respond to our recommendations. Mind you, that'll be well after the event, because the legislative requirement is to respond 6 months after the final report, which isn't until June next year. So I don't think I can really add much more than that.
Sorry, Anthony, I had a similar related question, just a clarification. Your draft report is out in April, and the task force work is still proceeding, so that there will be a public document in April, and I understand the task force work finishes about in the middle of the year, so there will be, I guess if you could just clarify that.
That's right. So it could be part of the public conversation as the government makes its decisions.
Just
indicate. Peter Southwell's my name. I'm just trying to establish the extent to which these negative emissions trajectories are chimerical or not. Do we believe that there are tipping points between now and then that would mean that we would lose control, or is there some chance of going negative and coming back up again?
There are other eminent personalities here in the auditorium that can answer that question, but these emission lines that I showed were simply scenarios of the anthropogenic emissions. They do not include a feedback of the climate system and saying our infrastructure is destructed, therefore we can't emit anymore, or anything of that sort. So there's no climate feedback. It is simply a policy choice whether, for example, you invest a lot in biomass and CCS, which most of these models assume drives the large negative emissions if they are in the scenario. Does that answer your question?
Luke Kemp, I'm a PhD student here at the Fenner School. A question primarily for Erwin. You mentioned the need to have a long-term decarbonisation goal for a credible policy signal. There are currently a range of options in the text, although it remains to be seen whether that's going to actually make it through to the end text. If it does, how important is the legal form of the agreement, as well as the short-term pledges by countries in terms of keeping that policy signal credible and reliable?
I think the first point to say is because the contributions will be nationally determined, It's really a question, in some respects, it's more of a question for a signal to the domestic policy environment as much as it is to the international one. You certainly need the long-term numbers to actually get a really good sense of whether we're on track to 2 degrees and so forth, but I think the more important part of the longer-term decarbonisation signal is that you're actually starting to send a credible signal to business to actually start making some investment decisions. But that itself is not going to deliver it. You actually need domestic policies in place which are credible, sustainable to deliver, otherwise you're not going to get there. In terms of the Paris outcome, whether there's a long-term target in there or not, I think remains to be seen. I think that there's now a coalition of more than 100 countries who would like that in there. In terms of what Malta's talking about, like a net zero or some sort of target like that, which would be a very important contribution. But if we don't have that, we've still got the 2-degree goal. And you can do the numbers. And this is where I think the important part for Australia is when I was talking about creating norms. If we accept that our national interest is in avoiding 2 degrees, and the Lima outcomes say that we should be justifying our target versus the objective of the Convention, which is effectively a 2-degree goal, then we should be justifying our target and contribution against how we think it is a fair contribution to 2 degrees. Because if we're not doing that, we're not starting to create international expectations and international norms that that's what other countries should be doing. And I think in some respects, that's the first step that the government needs to cross. Is it going to, when it advances its INDC later this year, justify it against the 2-degree goal or not?
Pep Canadell, Global Carbon Project, CSIRO. I just want to make sure that when we compare, with other countries, we also we keep an eye on the consumption-based emissions. It's kind of really interesting just to see the first pledge by Switzerland. I mean, here's a country where over the last 20 years they have increased the outsourcing of CO2 emissions by 10 times, despite their emissions have been stable for the last 20 years. So I think that it's important to see what happens with this outsourcing of CO2, because of course if everyone outsources CO2, the atmosphere won't see much of a change. So it just kind of as we, in the case of Australia, of course we're not big outsources. If we're looking at services, of course we are. If we're looking at the raw material that we send out.
Can I just make a broad point? I'd actually ask my colleagues on the panel to actually follow up with it. I think there will be a tendency in the conversation over the next 6 months to immediately start to compare whatever other country targets come forward with ourselves and what we should be doing. We really need to be careful when we're doing that, because every way you cut it, you can cut it every very different ways and you're going to get a different answer. But I think more fundamentally, it confuses the national target with your economic cost. And the two are not necessarily related. A country can reduce its emissions very efficiently and very cheaply, or it can do it very expensively. And that is not determined by your national target, that is determined by your domestic policies. So I think we need to be really careful about assuming that our national target equates to the economic cost we're prepared to take on as a country.
Certainly couldn't agree more. Most of the costs that businesses are rightly interested in, what are going to be the effects on my business, they all relate to policy. So those same businesses could be getting a tremendous whack with any target, depending on what the policy looks like, or they could be let off entirely with any target, depending on what the policy is. So it's all about the policies to get there that really has the particular impacts and how they're designed, what arrangements are put in place. I also agree very strongly on the issue of needing to take care, and that point was already made this morning, about how we compare with other countries. In fact, we're going to be putting out very soon a paper, a little how-to guide on how to compare targets. The main message of that paper is take care. You need to have a look across a range of indicators. There's a tendency to cherry pick which metrics people like to look at, and for whatever reasons you have to look across a range of metrics to try and get a better picture of how your target compares with others.
Final question before the tea break, Mike Smith.
Just a question to the panel. I was wondering, from your experience, if you could share with us whether the state governments have been engaging with you, and whether you see potential in the next 6 months, particularly with the new state governments, to see some decisions on targets being made there. Also, just wondering if you've been engaging at all with key sectors like the green building sector. A lot of people don't realise that carbon budget you showed, there's recent studies showing that if we build new buildings for 3 billion extra people, get people out of the slums, that'll chew up almost half that carbon budget. So I was wondering in your work whether you see some need to also engage both at the state, regional and at the sector level to make sure that everyone is moving in the same direction.
Just quickly on state government things. So state governments have very important levers of things that we don't normally kind of call them climate policies. So they have levers over lots and lots of transport planning and the provision of public transport. They have all these planning rules. They set standards for most of the standards for buildings, all those sorts of things. The way that cities get designed, the way all of those sorts of things are in state government hands. Huge amounts of planning approvals, all of these sorts of things. So state governments have huge levers, long-term, big important levers anyway. And then there's sort of things that are more normally called climate change policies on top of that. So I think it's fair to say we have seen a resurgence of interest from state governments in thinking about these kinds of issues. I think we would all like to try and avoid creating kind of a higgledy-piggledy patchwork of all sorts of crazy measures across the country. I don't think anybody wants to see that. So I think there's definitely a strong role for cooperation and coordination between jurisdictions.
I'll just do a shameless plug, because we actually released a paper today on what we thought state governments could be doing in the absence of effective federal policy. But I think Anthea's right that there is a greater interest in action from the state government. And I think what I find interesting about it is that it's really coming from the point of view of what are the opportunities that we can capture here. So if you think about the New South Wales government, for example, a Conservative government, it's very passionate about renewable energy and is thinking about the opportunities and what it can do on renewables. So I think that they're coming at it more from, okay, how can we capitalise on the inevitable decarbonisation? I'm not sure that everyone in every state government thinks that decarbonisation is inevitable, but I think there are some starting to wake up to that. However, but I think that there's still some baby steps that will need to be taken, because then there's some big issues that the state governments will need to engage in, which they're reluctant to at the moment. In particular, how you exit rather quickly some of our ageing and very inefficient coal-fired generators.
I have a really quick one just before we go. Anthea and Irwin, I think you're both recommending a 2025 target rather than a 2030 target for flexibility. If it was a 2030 target, not a 2025 target, how unhappy would you be? How problematic would you find that, or not?
It would depend on the number.
And just to add to that, it's pretty hard to imagine a scenario, I think, coming out of Paris where there will be not some level of expectation on a 2025 number, even if you have a 2030 number.
Okay. Before we thank our speakers, please be back at 3:40. We really will get going at 3:40 after the tea break. Excellent session. Thank you so much.